JavaScript supports higher order functions, and one place where that's seen is with the ES5 array methods. So these are methods that were added to the array object in ECMAScript 5. Now I find that these methods are not used very much, and I think it's because a lot of developers just aren't comfortable with them. They don't understand them completely, and so therefore they don't use them. We tend to use the for loop to accomplish everything we need to with an array. These methods are quite powerful. And so I want to spend this movie just introducing and helping to get comfortable with some of these methods. Now first, I mentioned higher order functions, and that JavaScript supports higher order functions. Now what is a higher order function? Well, basically that's simply functions that are able to act on other functions. So you can pass a function in as an argument, and you can return a function as a return value. Now the reason I mention higher order functions with these array methods is because every single one of them that we will look at allow you to pass in a function. In fact, you're required to pass in a function. You pass in a function, it iterates through each element in the array and passes that value to the function which you have passed in to that particular array method. And so they illustrate higher order functions. So the methods we're going to be looking at are these. The forEach method we'll look at first, map, filter. We'll look at both EveryIn. We'll look at those together because they're very similar. And we'll look at reduce and reduceRight together because they're also similar. So these are the methods that we will be taking a look at. My goal is to introduce them and show some simple examples. So let me jump to Sublime and we'll get started. All right, first off, I have a simple array. It has 5 numbers in it. And then I have a for loop that iterates through that array and multiplies each of the numbers by itself and logs it to the console. That's basically what it does. So if we were to save this, refresh the page and open up the console, we would see the results of that, 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25. So that's a common way for dealing with the elements of an array. Let's instead use the forEach method that's a part of the array object to first do this exact same thing, and then we'll modify it a bit to show some of the other things you're able to do. Now, as I mentioned, with all of these methods, the main argument that you pass in to the method is a function, and that function will act on each element of the array. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to use forEach, and I call that by first entering my array and then dot forEach, and then parentheses to indicate that we're invoking that method. Now I need to pass in a function. Now for all of these examples, I'm going to be using an anonymous function, meaning I will define the function at the time I'm passing it in. At the end, I'll show another technique for doing that, which is sometimes valuable. But for now, I'll just pass in an anonymous function. So there's my function structure. Now what do I want to happen for each element in the array? Well, I need to act on it, and the thing I want to do is I want to multiply it by itself. Now first I need to get that element. So by default, the forEach function will pass in to the function we've defined the element, and it will go through each element in the array. And so this variable here will contain the value of that array element. So then what do I want to do with it? Well, I simply log it to the console, val times val. That's all that's required. So let me save that, refresh. Now if you can see, we have 2 sets of numbers and they're exactly the same. All right. So we accomplish the same thing we would use a for loop for. So why use the array methods? Well, as you get more comfortable with them, they are much more powerful. It can be easier to solve certain problems with these methods. All right, I'm going to expand on this a little bit. Now, I mentioned that for each of these array methods, we pass in a function. Now, in turn, that array method passes a value to the function we define, as we saw here. But the value, the array element value, is not the only thing that can be passed in. For example, it's possible we could receive, with the forEach function and many of the other functions, 3 different arguments. The value, the index of that element, and then the array itself. All 3 of those could be passed in. So let's do something a little bit different. Let's say I wanted to replace each of the elements in the array with the resulting value of itself multiplied by itself. So the way we would do that is the array. Remember, that is the array that is passed in, so it's representing this. And then we can, using the index, specify the element in the array we want to replace, and then we set that equal to val by val. Simple as that. And then let's go ahead and log that to the console. Now notice I'm logging our original array. That's what I'm going to log. Let's go ahead and save that. Refresh. And there we go. There's our array with our new array with each of those elements multiplied by itself. So that's the forEach method. Let's take a look at map now. Now, map would allow us to accomplish the same thing that we just did with the forEach method, but it could be done a bit simpler. Map returns a new array. So the function you pass into map needs to return a value, because each time it returns a value, it's going to add that as an element to the new array. So let's look at how we would accomplish the same thing with the map method. Now, since map returns an array, I'm going to create a variable to place that array into and set that equal to AAR dot. So we use dot to access the methods that are associated with the array object, and then parentheses to invoke it. And I want to pass in a function. I'm going to do an anonymous function again. Now, as I mentioned, in order for map to work correctly, I need to return a value from my function. And the value we want to return is going to be this element multiplied by itself. So we need to add a val argument in order to get the value from the element. And then we can return val multiplied by val. Let me go ahead and remove this code here. And this time we're going to log to the console new array. We want to get this new array. So now we'll have our existing array still, but we'll have a new array. Let's go ahead and save that. We jump out, refresh. And as you can see, we have the values that we received in the previous example. But we use the map method to arrive at those values. So that is map. Map requires you to return a value. forEach simply iterates through all the elements, and you do whatever you need to on those elements with the function that you pass in. Map, the function you pass in, needs to return a value because it's going to build a new array from those values that are returned. All right, next we'll take a look at filter. I'm going to copy in a new array. This contains some scores on a quiz or something of that nature. It's a list of all of the scores. And we're going to use filter on this array. Now, for filter, you also pass in a function in order for it to work. But in the case of filter, it needs to be a predicate function. Now, what is a predicate function? Well, basically, the simple way to describe a predicate function is it is a function that returns either true or false. So you're going to test something with this function, and you're going to return whether it is true or false. That's what a predicate function does. Now, filter is going to create a new array, just like map did. So filter will create a new array, but it will only create a new array of those elements that meet the criteria, in other words, that return true. So meet the criteria of the function that we pass in. So let's take a look at how that would work. So since we're creating a new array, I'm going to declare that variable again, and I'll set that equal to arr dot filter. And now we're going to pass in a function. Anonymous function again. I want to grab the value, so I will enter a parameter for that value. Now we can define what we want this function to do. Now I want to create an array of all of the scores that are above 80. So simple idea here, not too complex. So I will have my original array, but I'll also have a new array, and it will just have the scores that are above 80. So as I mentioned, the function we pass in needs to be a predicate function. So it needs to return either true or false. So here's how we're going to do that. Return val greater than 80. If the value is greater than 80, it will return true. If it's less than 80, it will return false. If it returns true, whatever element that is will be placed in the new array. If it returns false, it will not be placed in that new array. All right, let me save that. Well, first, let's add a console statement to be able to see the new array. Okay, now we'll save it, jump out, refresh. There we go. There's our new array, and it only has values that are greater than 80. So as we can see, it went through each of those. Did not get this one because it wasn't greater than 80, but it got the 3 that are greater than 80. So filter creates a new array as well, but it requires you to pass in a predicate function. So a function that returns either true or false. And based upon what is returned, it builds the new array from that existing array. All right. We're going to take a look at every and sum now. Now, every and sum are methods associated with the array object that are themselves predicate functions. Meaning, remember, predicate meaning it returns either a true or false. So in using every or sum, it would be a situation where I want to test every value in an array and see if it meets some criteria. Now, the main difference between every and sum is every requires, in order for it to return true, it requires that every value in the array meet the criteria. Then it will return true if all of them meet the criteria. In the case of sum only requires that at least one element in the array meet the criteria. Then it will return true. If we're using every, as soon as it encounters a false, it returns false. So it doesn't have to go through every value if it encounters a false at the very beginning. It will just automatically return false because it requires that every value meet that criteria. Where sum will go through every value until it finds one that meets the criteria. And then at that point, it will return true. If it doesn't find one after going through it all, it will return false. So let's look at how we might use this with the same array of scores. Because every is a predicate function, I'm going to embed it inside an if statement. So I want to check if something is happening. Then I'm going to log something to the console. Else, I will log something different. All right. And what I want to check to see if everybody that took the quiz got over 80. All right. So the way I would do that is arr.every. Now we're going to pass in the function that I will use to run the test. I want to enter a parameter so I can grab the value from the array. Now here's the logic for my function. I need to return val is greater than 80. So if val is greater than 80, it will return true. If not, it will return false. Every will require that every single value return true, or the results here, those results will not be true. Okay? So are you understanding that? So here within the function we defined, we're checking to see if a value is greater than 80. And so that can return true or false. Because we're using every as the method, as soon as it encounters a false, it will return false as the value here. So this if statement will evaluate to false, and it will do whatever we have in the else portion. If all of them are true, then it will execute this console.log statement, which simply is everyone scored above 80. Otherwise, we have console.log not everyone scored above 80. So a simple application of every, but hopefully it illustrates how it works. So let me save that. Refresh. Not everyone scored above 80 is what we get. And basically, if we enter a console log statement here, let me just do that so you can see what's happening, where I log to the console val, save that, jump out. Notice that 0 is the only value that it ever gets to, because as soon as it gets to 0, it returns a false, and as soon as it has a false, it knows that every value can't be true, and so it returns false. All right, now let's change this to sum so we can see how sum is different. And we'll change this console.log statement to at least one received above 80. And this one, no one scored above 80. I'm still going to keep this console.log so we can see as it iterates through those. Go ahead and save that, jump out. Now notice it went to the second value because at that point it received a true. And so as soon as it received one true, it knew it could report that this value was true, because that's how sum works. It just has to have one element that returns true. All right, so let me change my array really quick, and let's see what we get. So now there's nothing above 80. Save that, refresh, and now you see we get them all printed out because it went through all of them. No one scored above 80 is what we get. All right, so that is every and sum. Every and sum are predicate functions that are associated with the array object, which means they return either a true or a false. Every requires that every element match the criteria. Sum requires at least one to match the criteria, to return true. Otherwise, they return false. All right, now let me show you another application of every. This is something that I do occasionally because I create applications that deal with quizzes, that deal with learning. And so sometimes you need to compare a fill-in-the-blank answer with possible correct answers and see if they're correct. So I'm going to copy in a simple example of this so I can illustrate how we use every. So here I have set up the correct answer string. It just has 3 words in it. In order to get the answer correct, the learner must enter all 3 words in that order. Now, obviously, this is a very simple application of this. I could have multiple correct answers and compare the learner's response to all of those. But I want to keep this simple. Here is the answer that was entered by the learner. In both these cases, I convert them to arrays. I split on the space. And so that creates an array of words. Now here's my results. Remember, every is a predicate function, and so it's going to return either true or false. So in this case, instead of embedding it inside an if statement, I put it separately. I think it can sometimes be easier to understand if you do that initially. And so what I do is I run every on the correct array. And then I pass in a function. And I'm grabbing 2 things. I'm grabbing the value. So I'm iterating through all the elements in the array. I'm grabbing the value. I'm calling that word. I'm putting it into a variable word. And then I'm also getting the index, what index it is. So 0, 1, 2. And then I'm returning word. I'm converting it to uppercase equal to, triple equal to, the answer array index. See, this is how I compare each of the words together and converting that to uppercase as well. So if every one of these returns true, then the results will be true. And I'll log to the console, it is correct. Otherwise, I'll log, sorry, that is wrong. So let me go ahead and save that, and let's take a look at what happens. Refresh, it is correct. So if there was one word that was wrong, sorry, that was wrong. Okay, so a simple example of something that I use every for in some of the work that I do. So that's EverySome. All right, let's move on to the final 2 methods, reduce and reduceRight. I will mainly show you reduce. ReduceRight is the same thing, except it starts from the other side of the array. Reduce starts from the left side of the array, from index 0, I should say, where reduceRight starts from the highest index. So I'm going to use my array of scores again, and we're going to do 2 things here. I want to get a sum of all the scores, and so say I wanted to compute an average, and I wanted to get the sum of all of them, and they're in this array. Obviously, you could do that with a for loop. But reduce is a method that is built for that. So the idea behind reduce is it's going to take all the values in an array and combine them in some way. The way it combines them has to do with the function that we pass in. So what it returns will be the result of all of those elements combined. So since it's going to return something, and right now I want to get the sum of all of those, I'm going to declare a variable sum and set that equal to arr.reduce. Now here is where I pass in my anonymous function. Now, the parameters that we will include in the function that we pass in are a bit different with reduce. The first argument is not the first element in the array. It is actually the accumulated results. So reduce is going to go through all of these elements, and it's going to do whatever we tell it to do, And each time it iterates again and calls this function, the first value it's going to pass in is the results, the ongoing results. And so I'm going to call that sum. And then I'll also indicate val. And then what I want to return is sum plus val. Now with reduce, in addition to the function which you pass in as the first argument, you could also pass in a second argument, which would be the first value for the accumulated results. Okay? If you don't include that, which I'm not going to, it makes that value the first element in the array. Okay? And that's really what I want anyway. So I won't pass in that second value. So there's one example of the reduce array. Let's do a second example so you can see how flexible this can be. You might think at this point, well, it's a way to add up all the numbers in this array, but it can be more flexible than that. For example, let's use reduce to find the maximum score. Whatever was the highest score of all these that were taken, let's find that. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we're going to pass in an anonymous function. The accumulated results is going to be the highest score, and so I'm going to call that high. And then val, so those are the two arguments that will be accepted by my anonymous function. And then the logic of my anonymous function is simply this. Return, so we got to return something, and I'm going to check to see if high is greater than val. If it is greater than val, then I'm going to return high. Otherwise, I'm going to return val. That would allow us to get the maximum score, the highest score from those set of numbers, using the tertiary operator. So now we have a sum and we have a max. Let's go ahead and take a look at those two values by logging them to the console. Just copy those in. Save that. Refresh. So the total is 550. The highest score is 100. So we could then use that sum value to find an average. We know what our highest score is. And we're able to do that with reduce. Now, as I said, reduceRight is the same functionality, but it starts from the other side of the array. Okay? Now, let me illustrate one more thing. Up to this point, I've been passing in anonymous functions. Well, it is possible to pass in a function that's already been defined, of course. It doesn't have to be an anonymous function. And that can be very powerful as well, because perhaps you have this function that you use frequently. And so you have it set up, and you use it throughout your code. And so you want to be able to call it using some of these array methods. So let's use as an example highest val. And this will simply be a function that takes two values, val1 and val2, and then returns whichever one is the largest or has the greatest value. So we do that with return val1 greater than val2. If it is, return val1. Otherwise, return val2. Now, we can replace our anonymous function with this function that has been defined. Since I did a function expression, that will not be hoisted to the top. So I'm going to move my function up here, so it's defined before I use it. Let's go ahead and save that, jump out, refresh, and we get the same values. So that's reduce and reduceRight. Hopefully introducing those methods that are a part of the array object will help you be more comfortable with them. They're great examples of higher order functions. As you can see, you're passing in a function each time you use them. So next time you find yourself trying to solve a problem with the for loop on an array, see if one of these array methods might work better. Hopefully you found that useful. If so, I would appreciate it if you liked the video. To view other videos from our channel, you can click the link in the middle of the screen. To subscribe to the channel, click the link to the left. We have new videos each week. And to visit our website where we have courses on JavaScript and other resources, you can click the link on the right. Thanks for watching.